Hi, it's Pastor Andy, and our Wednesday video for this week, still looking at the context of Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 17. Today we're talking about suffering, and we find this, unfortunately, at the end of this great passage about putting aside death and being made free and becoming a child and becoming an heir of God, and then he throws in this idea of suffering. But it really fits with yesterday. Yesterday I talked about crying out for help, and the question might be, well, what kind of help do we need? And it's answered in this very passage at the end of verse 17, but the challenge of this verse is that this verse starts so well. In fact, Romans 8:17 is again this great end to this great paragraph of moving us from slave to free to being a child of God. But right at the end, Paul interjects a few words to keep us grounded. Before I read the verse correctly, I'm going to leave out a few words because what I'm going to read is what we want the verse to say. Please understand, I'm going to read incorrectly first, and then I will come back and I will read this correctly. This is what we want Romans chapter 8 verses 16 and 17 to say. This is what we want it to say, but not what it does say. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, that we may also be glorified with Him. Man, if Paul had written that at the end of this great bit, we would just be charged up. We would be ready to go. Yeah, maybe the next verse doesn't make as much sense, but who cares? This would sound great, but that's not what Paul wrote. Instead, Paul wrote this. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, and here's the new part, provided we suffer with Him in order that we may also be glorified with Him. Did you hear the difference? Paul makes it clear that suffering is a part of what it means to be a follower of Christ. In fact, this statement is almost made, it really is made conditional because he says, providing this is true, then you are an heir with Christ. If we want to be glorified with Christ, that is, if we are going to spend eternity with Christ, then we must suffer with Him first. Now, Jesus is not here to physically suffer in the flesh any longer. However, in Acts chapter 9, verse 4, when Paul is on the way to Damascus, on what we call the Damascus Road, and he's on his way to Damascus, and Jesus is there to greet Paul in the sky, Jesus says to Paul, Paul, why are you persecuting me? He doesn't say, why are you persecuting these people? He says, why are you persecuting me? Indicating that when Christians suffer, Jesus is suffering also. Again, that's Acts 9:4. Now, persecution and suffering are not the exact same, but persecution is definitely a form of suffering. But suffering is broader. Suffering is much broader. And the book of Acts relates some explicit way that Paul and others suffered. Much of that was persecution. But Paul also writes about different types of suffering in certain places. He does so a couple of times in 2 Corinthians. One, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, one place, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 22 through 28, shares this. In fact, it is the words of 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that we find at least are a part of what Paul would include in sufferings. These sufferings include persecution, but they also include dealing with tensions and with anxieties of helping people to know Christ and helping churches to serve Christ. If we choose to follow Jesus, the truth is we will be persecuted. I mentioned this on Sunday. That was a promise that Paul made to Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. But it's also something that Jesus said. You can read Matthew chapter 10, verses 16 through 39. In that passage is a part of where Jesus says, I am sending you out like sheep amongst wolves. Do you think that the sheep have a chance amongst wolves? But like any good parent, and remember, this passage is not as much about us being children as it is God being our Father. Any good parent would not want their child to suffer. God knows we will suffer. And again, Paul says very clearly that suffering leads us on the path to glory, Romans 8:17, but to guide us through that suffering, to encourage us in that suffering, and to sustain us as we suffer, God has given us His Spirit. And according to verse 15, as I mentioned in yesterday's video, it is by His Spirit that we can cry out and know that we are heard. So sufferings are real. But I leave you with some encouragement from the pen of Paul. In Romans 8:18, which we'll focus on next week, Paul says, For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us. Likewise, in 2 Corinthians 4, he has just shared different types of sufferings in verses 7 through 12, but then picking up a verse or two later, he said, I believed, I also spoke, we also believe, so we also speak, knowing that He who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into His presence. For it is all for your sake, so that His grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. Verses 16 through 18, let me finish that off. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, let me pause. It's not talking about getting older. It's talking about suffering. It's talking about being persecuted. It's talking about being beaten. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So yes, we must suffer in this life. Some will certainly suffer more than others, but all suffering in this life is temporary in light of eternity. The suffering is real, but one day, on the other side, it will be forgotten. The suffering is hard, but none of us will carry the weight of suffering that Jesus did for us. And ultimately, we know that we do not suffer alone because we can cry out, and we know that we are heard by a Father who loves us, by a Father who cares for us, and that one day will deliver us from all suffering, welcoming us as His children into His presence, which will far surpass our wildest expectation and outweigh the most challenging of circumstances that we will ever face. So yes, Paul included these words, unfortunately, because it would have read so much easier, so much nicer, so much better, been easier to digest. But the reality is, if we have to suffer a little bit for the sake of what's to come on the other side, Paul says it's worth it. Jesus proved it's worth it. And God will make sure that we benefit from it for all of eternity.